Achim, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's good to be with you, Tania. Thank you.
Well, the UNDP has just launched its Human Development Report, and it makes for very depressing reading. Unprecedented uncertainty. What has led us to this point, and how worried are you?
Well, as its title says, uncertain times, unsettled lives. I think it tries to capture this moment in time in which we are truly as people, as citizens of countries, but also really as a human family, confronted with a profoundly disturbing moment in time. We are still recovering from a pandemic, and as you know, just a few days ago, we passed the milestone of 1 million deaths just this year from COVID-19. We then have seen the extraordinary impact that the war in Ukraine has had on millions of people, and a reminder of how interdependent we really have become in terms of the world's markets. And then, the images just of the last few days, again, this drastic reminder that climate change has arrived. We are the generation that is now living through its impacts. Pakistan, a third of its territory flooded for the second time in 12 years, by the way, because this is an event that actually of equal catastrophic proportions happened 12 years ago. Forests on fire, rivers drying up. We are at a moment in time where we are dealing with so many short-term crises and shocks, and every government, every society, every household has to focus on short-term crisis management. Yet we really also have to keep an eye on the transformational changes that are needed. So here we are, year 2022. The world is in distress, and the report tries to both understand of how do you deal with short-term shocks, but not lose sight of where we actually need to invest, where we need to change in order to come out of this situation.
Well, you talked there, Achim, of course, about the pandemic, the impact that that's had, and the war in Ukraine on food insecurity, energy prices, the cost of living crisis. Why haven't institutions like the United Nations or other global leaders done more?
Well, that's a good question. And I think in part what we are seeing, first of all, is I think a reality that demonstrates how divided the world is right now. We have an international financial architecture, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. We have the United Nations, but the G20 as well. And yet the experience, I think, right now is of political divisions paralyzing our ability to step up. I mean, all our institutions are trying our best. I mean, the humanitarian crisis that the UN is trying to address on a daily basis have increased exponentially. The number of refugees, internally displaced people, is at record levels. We have seen through just the first 3 months of the conflict in Ukraine and its impact on food markets and fuel markets, 71 million people fall into poverty. And that was just in the first 3 months on top of COVID-19. We are trying to deal with crises on a scale that are in some ways without precedent, and that is part of our challenge. And I think we have to come back to asking ourselves, how do we empower the institutions that we have created over 7 decades after the Second World War to enable us to work together despite our differences? I mean, this is a reality that applies to a pandemic or to climate change, or indeed to new threats also from technology. Cybercrime is another issue that is no longer on the horizon. It's now with us every day. It can threaten national power grids. Our ability to work together has to be rediscovered, because otherwise I think these kinds of crises will simply affect countries even more.
How does this setback in human development affect the impact of the climate crisis and, of course, what the UN is trying to do with the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, it's a major setback. The Human Development Index that UNDP has been providing as a yardstick for the world to measure its progress in human development for over 3 decades has now for the first time actually been in reverse mode for 2 years. And just to give you a sense of how dramatic it is, on average, 1 out of 10 countries might face a reversal when there is a natural disaster or during the financial crisis. In the current setting, we have 9 out of 10 countries actually declining in terms of human development indices. That is unprecedented in both the era of the human development reports, but also gives you a sense of the scale. And behind those statistics, however, Tania, lies something much more profound, which is how disruptive this is to our societies. We have also found in our work that 6 out of 7 people feel insecure today about what happens next. parents no longer have the confidence that their children will grow up in a society and an economy where they're better off. Imagine what young people feel like today when they look at the future. And that has also eroded trust. And then you immediately come into this territory and people are insecure. They're afraid, they're fearful, they are more open to extremist narratives. They become politically polarized. And so our cohesion, our societies, and our communities is also, well, in a sense, we are falling apart as a community. And that makes it very difficult to act on climate change or indeed on any other challenge.
What needs to be done now, Achim, and how concerned are you about global social unrest?
Very concerned. I think we saw it already before COVID-19, how inequality in many countries created the kind of breeding ground in which political radicalization was occurring. We saw unprecedented protests, and no, not just in poorer countries, in inverted commas, but actually in some of the wealthiest countries also. We have lost a degree of social consensus. And I think what the report tries through, the Human Development Report this year, is to say we need to put people and choices back in the center. We can describe the world in statistics, empirical evidence, but at the end of the day, this is about people and the choices they make. And I think what we are trying to draw attention to is therefore how, first of all, governments deal with their citizens, and also how citizens can regain trust in their government institutions. And the report also points to three broad areas where we need to invest in, for instance, social protection. We have learned during COVID-19 how vital it was for countries to be able to provide cash transfers, the kind of social safety nets. We need to also invest in insurance, the kind of climate risks that we're now seeing, but also the shocks to our health systems. The way we are able to protect people from falling back into poverty and having to borrow money not to invest in something but to pay health bills, which is now a reality for millions, is clearly not the direction to go. And thirdly, innovation. We live in an age of extraordinary technological opportunity, whether it's the digital frontier, quantum computing, but also advances in health and scientific research, a new vaccine in a matter of 18 months, helping the world to cope with COVID-19. If we can focus our energies, our investments, and also recreate a sense of cohesion in how we approach these issues, we can come out of these crises, be it climate change, be it our vulnerability to pandemics, but not in the current chaos that is now reigning.
You're talking about some of the solutions there, but what kind of impact do you want this report to have?
First of all, I think we need to reflect for a moment of how we got here. And I think it is important, and this report is obviously not something that you read in 3 minutes. It triggers research, it triggers debate and dialogue. And in that sense, it is a way of helping us to not simply feel threatened by what's happening, but begin to unpack it. And once you start looking at this, you can see, and as I said, we can continue to talk about carbon emissions or about inflation or GDP growth, but we need to get back to where people make choices. This is essentially about also rediscovering that many of our citizens feel so disempowered that they're also disengaging. The choices we can make today are very real. I obviously, as head of the United Nations Development Program, I travel frequently. I visited recently 2 countries that I just want to mention where a deliberate choice to address climate change and decarbonization has enabled them to make a complete transformation of their electricity generating infrastructure. Kenya now produces on the African continent 90% plus of its electricity with geothermal, solar, and wind power. Uruguay, another country, has transformed its electricity system, over 90% of its electricity today with renewables. It is now converting its bus fleet for public transport to EV-powered public buses. Why is it that some countries are able to take these bold decisions and others don't? It is because they are essentially involving their citizens. They make hard-nosed analysis, they create choices and opportunities and options, and then they move forward. And I could go on with the list. Denmark, another pioneer in the transition towards low-carbon economies, and these are the examples we need to look at.
Well, talking of lists, Achim, the US is at number 21 on the Human Development Index. How significant is that position for them?
Well, it's the first time that the United States has dropped out of the top 20. And I think in some ways it's something indicative of the crisis that the United States faced during the pandemic. I mean, a great deal of that has obviously to do with life expectancy, which is one of the criteria that, define the composite human development index. And the United States life expectancy has gone down, and quite significantly. So this is one explanation, the impact on incomes as well. But the US was also recovering economically very quickly, um, as opposed to many developing countries that no longer had the fiscal resources to invest in the recovery. So we have also seen a divergence amongst economies. But I think when one of the wealthiest nations on earth is dropping in its human development index, it is a partial reflection also of the tensions maybe and the frustrations and the debates that are occurring in the US today about what kind of nation, what kind of economy, what kind of future do we see for ourselves?
What does this all mean for our world going forward?
I think in many respects, it's a moment of distress that we have to overcome. Fear, uncertainty, insecurity paralyze us. So we have to begin to refocus on what are ways forward that take us out of what otherwise are increasingly stressful futures. Climate change is playing out before our very eyes right now. We are literally in a time window of maybe a decade or so in which we can still take some very significant steps. After that, we are locked in. And I think these are the kinds of debates we now need. We are too polarized in our communities, in our countries, and also as an international community. We don't invest in one another. Rich countries are still not meeting their obligations to poorer countries made over a decade ago to help them accelerate investment in greener and cleaner energy technologies. These are failures that will, in a sense, have an impact for years and decades to come. So when we meet again in later this year in the climate conference, I think citizens should ask very hard questions of their leaders. What are we doing in order to be able to work together rather than against each other?
With this unprecedented reversal in human development, what does that mean for a sustainable future?
It makes it, first of all, more difficult because the more we continue in the current mode, and particularly if only short-term crises are dealt with, then yes, we will use up our taxpayers' money to subsidize petrol at the petrol pump. And that is a way in which we are bankrupting governments across the world right now. And the irony being also that these subsidies, these very untargeted subsidies, are not very efficient. Most of those subsidies then accrue to the better off in our society because they have cars. They actually use the larger quantities of petrol or diesel. We need to become far more efficient and smart about how we protect those who are most vulnerable with targeted cash transfers, but not put a subsidy on fossil fuels that essentially has just reversed years of trying to remove these subsidies, which were distorting the markets. If you subsidize fossil fuels, you inevitably make renewable energy much more difficult as a transition and future platform for generating electricity, for mobility. And that's why the report tries to also help governments and societies understand what can you do to cope with short-term crises, which are very real and are having a major impact on household income, on poverty levels, without sacrificing long-term transformational change, whether it is about resilience and protection against pandemics, whether it is the corrosive power of inequality that has disrupted so many societies, or whether it's climate change. And that is the focus of the United Nations Development Program, helping countries to continue to advance their sustainable development while coping with the shocks of short-term crisis.
Will they listen?
I think increasingly, yes, because people and citizens across the world are also saying enough is enough. We cannot go from one crisis to another and, in a sense, have the feeling that the future looks less and less promising. This is not what societies, what I think each individual aspires to. And I think that pressure is mounting on leaders in business, in government, to be bolder, to be more courageous, but also to be more honest. We need to reestablish trust in one another. From there, we can build, I think, the kinds of decisions that are needed.
Achim Steiner from the UNDP, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tania.